Well, I'd like to welcome you all once again to this session. It's been extremely productive, and I think what we've been doing is just looking at the entire G20 process. It is also important to remember that B20, which represents the business end of the G20 process, is something which is being looked at very closely at this stage in Delhi. And I think as part of the B20 process, there are several, about 10 key processes that they're looking at to make the entire G20 agenda accessible and relevant to more than 1 billion plus around the world, certainly in the G20 grouping. We've got wonderful panelists with us today, representing a cross-section of interests. Let me come to you first, Mr. Singh, and ask you this question. One of the key issues that G20 is looking at is the issue of inclusion. It's key, of course, to India's economic growth, but it is also a G20 agenda. How?
Well, in multiple ways. First and foremost, that the digital story, which was rolled out in India with great alacrity, great success, is altering the architecture of governance. And the example of this altered architecture, of the empowerment which it has done in terms of gender empowerment, in terms of access to public services, in terms of the way in which the architecture of governance had hitherto been organized, being altered in fundamental, unrecognizable ways. That's one important takeaway from this G20. And I was in a session just now on exactly this very issue, which you have asked, and I'm sure that my colleague here, Veera, would like to add her own voice along with Borje on this very important question which you have raised.
In fact, let me go across to Mr. Render first about digitalization. And we've discussed this earlier, you and I, but I think it's worth repeating. India's digitalization model, can it be replicated elsewhere, and if so, how?
First part of the question, yes, and second part of the question, hopefully. I think part of the reason why India now 3 years in a row has the fastest economic growth of any of the large economies is based on the digital ID where you started. 1.4 billion people have their digital ID. And if you look at India, the digitalization rate, people that have access to a cell digitally connected is just amazing. And if you look overall globally, it is close to 4 billion people that are not digitally connected with affordable prices. So this is a huge comparative advantage for India now moving forward. I just saw the other day on TV a grandmother, I think it was the state of Assam, sitting there with her cell and wiring money to the grandchildren on her own cell. Where else is that happening? And if India is 1.4 billion people digitally connected, and there are 4 billion people not digitally connected, you can just think of 7 billion people, you have a huge, huge advantage. That's why we urgently have to connect the 3.5 to 4 billion people that are not connected. That's a prerequisite for economic growth, it's a prerequisite for meeting the SDGs, and it's a prerequisite for poverty eradication.
And ma'am, it's also about, ultimately it's all about inclusion. We're talking about digitalization without necessarily having referred to what the end game is, and that is inclusion. It's inclusion of women, of men, of children. It's about ensuring basic fundamental rights. Therefore, when we talk about digitalization, what is it about digitalization that appeals most to you in the context of development?
No, thank you very much. I think 3 things. The first one is, as you said, inclusion. And Borge talked about the 3.5 billion people that are not included, most of them in the developing world. And so the question for me for financial inclusion is a macro and a micro issue. The first one is when you're not, if you're not financially inclusive, for those who are out of it, not having access to financial tools is a terrible thing. And poverty is a terrible thing. And we see that when we have crises, like the COVID crisis. The first thing that happens is the developing world cannot buy and cannot access COVID and COVID vaccines, right? And so essentially what you need is at that macro level to get inclusion right. Because you must get inclusion right at the macro level, which means global cost and access to financing. We cannot have spreads, credit spreads of sovereign bonds that are 10% different from emerging market economies and developed economies. You cannot have negative transfers going from the developed to the developing countries on the capital markets. So first of all, we must have equal or close to equal access to capital markets, which means developing our capital markets institutions. Secondly, and something that we talk about a lot, is local currency investment and growth. If you don't have that, then we are not really talking about the right kind of financial inclusion at that global level for investment. Now you come to the micro level, and what does that mean? When we talk about, and we have another word for talking about non-inclusion, which is essentially the informal economy. The conversation around the informal economy is really about non-inclusion, and I think that what India is doing with the Aadhaar program is really about including people, first of all, in the financial sector, and the minute you have enough information about them, they become formal. We can actually bring the SMEs in, we can grow them faster, and they can actually become then job-creating entities, and that is why you are the fastest growing economy in the world, because your Aadhaar economy is now paying off. People are joining the formal economy, people are employing others, and they're creating value. And I think if we don't have that globally, we cannot get the kind of growth that we need to get out of this crisis.
Yeah, and so just, and go ahead, but I wanted to ask you, just using two of the words that were referred to, inclusion and equal opportunity, two terms, one of the areas where India really prides itself and has a role is in medicine. We are called the pharmacy of the world, and the fact that during COVID we worked towards the inclusion of people around the world with our vaccines, it's something which can be replicated in the future as well. Is that an area, pharma and medicine, where you see India potentially having a lasting imprint within the G20 and outside? Mr. Singh.
Well, let me first add something to what Veera said, with which I fully agree, and thank you, Boshe, for pointing out the huge implications this has for empowering a lot of people who are outside this digital framework. Let me say that from the macroeconomic perspective point of view, something, Veera, which you touched per se, digital access is also a growth disruptor. People are concerned with the enigma that given a lot of other disabilities, how is it that India is now the fastest growing economy of the world? This is because economic models do not work when you introduce a disrupting factor. That disrupting factor is technology with a medium of digital access. So I think as we go forward, the world will learn the power increasingly from experiments of the kind which we are having on what it can do to disrupt the typology of growth and of growth projections, which is the basis on which all macroeconomic projections are made. So the power of the digital world and the conquest of the digital world is going to be growth supportive, a growth disruptor, as technology will break down earlier models and earlier calculus on which growth projections and linear programming was made.
Yeah. Would you like to take that question on India being the pharma of the world, the pharmaceutical sort of headquarters in a sense of the world? And therefore, when we're talking about inclusion, when we're talking about equal opportunity, what role does India have towards meeting the medical requirements of countless people?
So I think many are aware that India is the back office of the world. Is now increasingly also playing a role in manufacturing. But what many forget is on the pharmaceutical side, India is world leading. I think maybe 70 to 80% of all antibiotics that are produced globally come from this country. And this is a sector that also leads to the need for a lot of R&D. and also investments. So I think India has a huge opportunity to go from manufacturing, also when it comes to pharmaceutical products, generic products, to also invest and be the developer and have the patents, and then you have the whole value chain. So I think this is another area where India has to go for the full value chain in the future, and to start with part of it also gives you insights where you can then leapfrog later on. And this is a challenge for many emerging economies and developing economies, that what you export cheap and then you have to buy expensive. India is maybe breaking that impasse.
Sure. Ma'am, let me ask you this. When we talk, if we look at the agenda of the G20 and B20 as well, there's a lot of focus on establishing resilient supply chains. Now, this is important because when you use the words resilient supply chains, it can refer to everything from food to superconductors. But let's focus on what affects countries in the G20 and beyond. We are facing a crisis with the Ukraine war, huge food inflation, oil inflation. So therefore, again, as part of the G20 concerns and agenda, how is ensuring resilient supply chains a key part of it?
I think it's three things. There is, of course, the big new term that we have learned post-COVID, which is friendshoring,
Right.
which means bringing supplies closer to home. What we have seen in economies like China, even like the United States, is there is so much of growth that you can generate with domestic consumption. But at some point, you need to go out and trade matters. And I think, again, the two largest trading partners in the world, the United States and China, still traded $9 billion, even as we talked about friendshoring. And we know that trade is really the driver of growth and the thing that lifts most people out of poverty the fastest and delivers financial inclusion. Now, as we move towards this sort of discussion, I think friendshoring is another term, maybe for some people call it deglobalization. I don't believe that's going to happen because at the end of the day, since we're in the B20 summit, the business community is looking at delivering shareholder value, and they have to optimize shareholder value. And my sense is that as one does that, one is going to go back to centers of the world where you have the best comparative advantage and where you can do that trade. Having said that, I don't think that before we started talking about friendshoring, we had optimized those trade relations. And so we can do much, much better. And that's a little bit what Brenda was talking about in terms of, yes, India used to export pharmaceutical products, but had you done it the best? I look at Africa, for example. When you look at a country like Kenya, Kenya produces antibiotics. But we haven't worked together to optimize the chain. I think we import, and what we found out in COVID is we import about 60% of the inputs for the production of antibiotics from India. But that supply chain was not optimized. And we can do that better. We can do that better by defining your private sector and our private sector. Same thing with Egypt, right? In Egypt, when the COVID crisis hit, Egypt is one of the largest producers of pharmaceutical products on the continent. But they overproduce for the continent and under-export. Yeah. And so we can, again, optimize those markets with yourselves and ourselves. And my sense is that once we sort of revisit our supply chain conversation, we hopefully will find better optimization of some of those processes and products to be able to make sure that, because every product that we produce, I think we learned that the COVID vaccine has 140 inputs produced globally. And each one of those has a center where you can do it the best, the fastest, and the cheapest. And right. That's part of financial inclusion, is getting access to something at its cheapest cost. So my sense is we will work better on that. As a large country like yourselves, you can first optimize that just in India. Sure. And that's what's going to power your growth even better.
Mr. Brenda, over the last several years, the World Economic Forum has obviously changed your agenda, your outlook to reflect newer concerns and newer realities. One of the realities, of course, is climate change and sustainable growth. Do you find the WEF's agenda in that regard very aligned, in a sense, to what we are seeing at G20?
Very much so. I think we're on a daily basis seeing that this climate crisis is not something that our children or grandchildren will be faced with. That's what we used to say. We're doing it to secure their future. I think climate change is happening here and now, and we're paying a price. We see it, for example, affecting agricultural production in many places. The reality is that the cost of inaction now clearly exceeds the cost of action. But we are not seeing enough action, but I think India's G20 presidency underlines also the need of a faster decarbonization. And I think we need to change the perspective. It is cheaper to deal with it than just to postpone this change that is necessary. And also comes a lot of business opportunities with the decarbonization. But we are also reminded that it is tough, because it's like squaring the circle in the sense that there is a lot of people even lacking access to basic electricity. We've seen also energy security issue in Europe. So how to make sure that you go towards the decarbonization, but at the same time you're able to deal with the energy challenges and access challenges. Because without access to energy, there will be no real development. Yeah. And here, I think we need to be realistic with building bridges. There are, of course, better with natural gas than with coal. There's also better with fossil fuel if it's captured and stored. Of course, that is not the final solution, but until you get breakthroughs on technology and you get also cheaper energy like solar and wind as an alternative to the fossil fuel ones, you also have to think in a holistic way. And things do change very fast. If we had this conversation 3 years ago, I am not sure if AI was going to be mentioned at all. Of course, with my two very smart colleagues on the panel, they might have raised it. But you see how things change fast and new things come in. If we had this conversation 10 years ago and I said, oh, solar would go down to 1/10 of the price, or I would say wind would go down to 1/7 of the price in 10 years, people would say, oh, that guy is a little bit blue-eyed, you know, he's a bit naive. But no, many places in the world, solar is competitive. It's even cheaper than alternatives, and there's no subsidies needed. And there is like the new era, and I'm not going to be that long, but that also NK mentioned. The new technologies are also changing the way we have to think around economics. I was thinking when the Americans launched this new supply side economics with having a big stimulus in the middle of a situation where they tried to raise the interest rate, that this was going to be very, very challenging. And it seems like they're balancing it in quite a good way. So I think we have to look at austerity differently, but I also think we have to look at fiscal stimulus in a more positive way if it is targeted towards what we really want to achieve, digital inclusion, transformation of the way we produce energy, and etc.
So let me ask you this, Mr. Singh. Are you satisfied at the pace at which the cost of green energy solutions is coming down? Some would suggest it's not coming down fast enough.
Well, I think that whereas we can have 2 points of view on whether the speed of the decline in the cost, availability, and access of green energy is coming down or not, I think one of the very important enigmas is the financing of an orderly transition. And this is easier said than done, Vishnu. In the panel of which Veera is an important member, along with Larry Summers and myself, we are trying to estimate, and that's the heart of the reform of the multilateral development banking system, what is the financing requirement between now and 2030 to be able to have an orderly transition to a period in which dependence on renewable energy is high. That cost, in a brilliant report done by Veera, is estimated to be roughly $3 trillion a year. And $3 trillion, if we assume the $2 trillion out of the three, come from domestic resource mobilization through much better economic management policy to growth and tax buoyancy and all the virtuous circles around it, that leaves $1 trillion. $1 trillion is a challenge which we are working on, of which 500 billion is from private capital. And therefore, what kind of incentive structures and catalyzation can be done to private capital of $500 billion a year in terms of risk mitigation, in terms of other measures. And then the balance 500 billion, which we hope can come through tripling the lending capability of multilateral development banks. Now, to give you a ballpark figure, Vishnu, all multilateral development banks, and there are many more than you can count. They are much beyond Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, the World Bank Group, the Inter-American Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. That's a large family. If all of this is added, roughly speaking, they lend about $120 billion a year. The challenge that Veera and I are facing is how do you take $120 billion closer to $120 billion closer to $400 billion a year, which is tripling their lending capability. And what combination of measures will achieve that? What harnessing of innovative private capital, blended finance, hybrid capital, and what are those structures and mechanisms? I emphasize mechanisms. I emphasize mechanism because only yesterday and today, a mechanism was being talked about in the G-20. And this is the connection that I see, of whether a part of the realization from what we call corporate social responsibility, in which India again has taken a lead. We are in the first country to have corporate social responsibility. Whether a fraction of that could go towards the ability to leverage fresh capital for mitigating the problems of climate, pandemic, transboundary challenges, and global public goods.
Ms. Songwe, the future of the the G20 as a grouping, and indeed if you look at countries around the world, rests closely with skilling and mobility and reskilling. Could you tell us a little bit more about how this is essential, because ultimately employment will improve the status of lives, countless?
No, thank you. And just to pick up on the points that were made, and the two meet, when you think about it, one of the reasons India is growing so fast is because the electric vehicle industry is booming, and we need to do that, and we need to do that more. 60 million more electric vehicles will be on our roads by 2050. For that, you need to be able to reskill. As I was listening to the CEO of Ford Motors the other day, and somebody asked him, so how do you think about Tesla coming into your market? And he goes, you know, Tesla is an IT company, we make cars, and Tesla has realized that designing cars is not that easy. And then the next day, they made a cooperative agreement. But beyond that, they also made a cooperative agreement with a mining company that does the chips. And my sense is we need to reskill as we talk about this transition, and this is the climate economy. And one of the things that we say in this report, and you should all look at it, which is the Trebling report, part of it is to build the capacity of the MDBs to do precisely that reskilling. We're going to need to take people from, you know, the financing, the banking sector to the digital banking sector. We're going to take people from just collecting data to data centers and AI. We're going to move people from fixing cars to being technologists that can actually make sure that you can drive a Tesla. And this is a whole reskilling process. And yesterday, we were in a restaurant in Washington, D.C. I was in Washington, D.C. And in the restaurant, they have a robot that shows you to your seat. Except that when you have tight restaurants, it shows you to your seat, but it blocks your seat. And so a human has to come and punch the process. But in Nairobi, we have a center called the iCloud Factory. And it's an amazing place. You go in there, and there's at least 3,000 young women especially, but also men who are in the university studying engineering. And they essentially program the driverless cars in California. They do the work for the football teams, and they sort of, and so my sense is the digital economy, the climate economy, are going to be more job creating, but the only way they can do that is if we do this reskilling and we begin to train. It's not going to be a job destroyer. It's going to destroy some of the basic hand jobs that we do, but it's going to create a lot more jobs. And that is where we need the private sector. That is where we need multilateral development banks. And that is why we need the 400 billion. I want to end there. It's really in the report that we did on the trebling. It's really about trebling financing, but also trebling capacity. We must do the capacity bit. And the reason India is doing so well is you have done the capacity bit as well. If you had only done the IT bit, you would have gone no way. But measuring and bringing the IT bit, the capacity bit, and finally the regulatory bit together is what delivers value and growth.
You know, we were talking about job creation. I know that the World Economic Forum deals a lot with artificial intelligence, AI, and its future and its potential economic impact. Are you someone who believes that that might result in a loss of jobs?
I totally agree with what Overa said. If you can upskill, right skill people, there's huge opportunities also coming out of the fourth industrial revolution, including with artificial intelligence. So you also have to, Churchill once said that the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you're likely to see. And if you go through, start with the Industrial Revolution and go until today, all the different parts of the Industrial Revolution has led to that some jobs will then be, you will have to change, and some jobs are lost, but all the phases have created new opportunities where you can produce higher up in the value chain, and when you can produce and increase productivity, that's also increasing prosperity. I don't think there is any reason why this new phase of the industrial development will lead to less jobs. I think it will lead to more jobs and more interesting jobs, higher up in the value chain, higher prosperity, and increased and productivity. So, but of course, there are some prerequisites for success there, and I'm worried that this winner takes it all that we have seen also when it comes to technology. We've seen it on the companies, and all this can continue. And here, I think we need to invest in developing countries also to give them the same opportunities, because there's then a lot of positive dividend when it comes to demography in these countries. And the young people are the ones that are really, really smart, and that we have to give opportunities in this new area. So of course, some of the old jobs will not be there in the future, but I think there will come better jobs. But you know, you have when there are so fundamental changes, you have no guarantee, even if you're doing well today, that you will do well tomorrow. If you look at, for example, the 10 companies that have the highest value today, market value, 20 years ago, 4 or 5 of them did not exist.
Right.
So in 20 years, I'm pretty sure there will be new companies there that maybe are startups or unicorns today. And 1/3, and India is number 3 in the world when it comes to these startups, huge opportunities in these countries. And it's the same with countries. Like if you look at Argentina in 1945, it was maybe the 2nd richest country in the world. They took the Peronistas 10 years, and then it was a lower middle income country. So look at the new technologies, embrace them, educate your people. If you have a good governance, you can also thrive and prosper.
Mr. Singh, one final question to you as we wrap this up. Mr. Bogo referred to startups. Now, we've been the startup capital in a sense of the world, but we've seen a little bit of a change. We've seen some companies not do as well as they expected to, a shakeout in a certain sense. Are you still optimistic about India continuing to be a major startup hub in the world?
Of course, I still continue to see India to be not only the prime mover, a catalytic, but an important destination for startups. I did say in an earlier part of this interview that technology is an enabler, but also a disruptor. I think that we are undergoing a period of that readjustment of startups with newer technologies in the horizon, with newer challenges in the horizon. I think as we readjust and recalibrate, I see that the vibrancy which we talked about in the startup will come back to this country with even greater force. Let me finally say, the first question which you had asked, Vishnu, was about the fact of the synergy between B20 and G20. India, in a couple of months from now, would hand over the presidency of the G20 to another developing country, which is Brazil. But as you know, Vishnu, the terminology of G20 is like a rolling stone. Every year, the presidency changes. What will be so vastly different about India handing over is that it has, in this period, managed to gather moss, indeed green grass, and that would be consistent with the Prime Minister's vision of handing over a green grass-grown presidency to its successors.
I think that's a wonderful opportunity to end this conversation. I'd like to thank the three of you very much for being with us. Lots to think about, not just about G20 this time, about where we are headed. Thank you very much indeed.
All through this morning, we've had several aspects of India's G20 leadership being discussed. Some say digital, some talk about the emerging economy, some talk about the power that India has become. According to you, what would be the defining aspect of India's G20 leadership? Whether it is cultural, whether it is psychological, what's the impact of this leadership from your point of view?
It's a little early to answer the question because, of course, we have the summit coming up in 2 weeks' time. But I would say that India has broken the mold on how you do a G20 presidency. I don't think any succeeding presidency is going to be able to go back to the past, because what India has done is to have this take its huge scale and apply it to the G20. That means we've been to the most amazing parts of India. I was in the Andaman Islands at the start of the G20 presidency. It was a fantastic privilege to be there. Everywhere from Lakshadweep as well, there's been a meeting there, all over the country. And so that scale, and the great thing is it's brought a lot of people here. I'm sure it's true of the States as well. Today we've got the global chief executive of HSBC, the global CEO of BP are both here. I've had a cabinet minister every week for the last few weeks. Some of them are learning about India. Some of them know about India already. It was great to take our finance minister, who 30 years ago, like me, had lived in India, to come back and see Bangalore 30 years later. So the scale and the application of the scale, but also the ambition. And the ambition to tackle the big problems of the world. And I think Amitabh Kant spoke a bit about that this morning when he talked about global hunger, the fact that you have more people in poverty, the fact that you have low growth in some parts of the world. Finally, I think India and the G20 Sherpa has brought tremendous energy. We always talk about now moving on to renewables. I think if you wired Amitabh Kant up, I think you could probably power most of Delhi off that man's energy.
You, Atul?
I'm a retired diplomat, so I'll give a business perspective because I now work for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I think India's vision that it has set out in its G20 year through all of the various events is very positive, it's very compelling, and it's very focused on the human being. I grew up in Africa. I was born in Africa, grew up in Africa. Of course, I'm an American. I have an Indian parentage as well. And I see how what India is doing for its own citizens is potentially scalable for countries all around the world. You look at the fintech here, the digital empowerment, the environmental stewardship. These are positive visions. And so this G20 year has been remarkable, not just for all of the reasons that that Alex has mentioned, but for the fact that it focuses on the human being. And this is where your business community and the American and British and other business communities help fuel the innovation that is going to help us all to live happier, more prosperous, and frankly, more meaningful lives. And the other great thing about the Indian vision for the G20 in this year is that it also focuses on the future freedom and happiness of humanity. And at the U.S. Chamber, we do believe in the founder's vision of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we see that in everything that India is doing. So I really applaud what India has done.
Okay, interesting points both of you have made, but as you go forward, and this is a year ago, we started having the Ukraine conflict. Has there been a change in the way India has been seen since then, or is that still the elephant in the room?
I'm very careful not to mix India and elephants in any metaphor, which I now try to produce. So the interest in India and India's power in the world is a long-term thing. Yeah? That's already there. It will grow a lot over the next decade. As I say, India will be one of the 3 most impactful countries in the world. Russia's invasion of Ukraine shows the very contested world we're in, where an autocracy can basically invade a democracy and try to take its territory. We thought we'd kind of put an end to that in Europe, and Europe has had the most terrible experience of that, and thanks to the support of the United States, got over that experience. So it's a very shocking thing to see inside Europe. What you also see is the global consequences of what at first was described as a European war. But let's look what's happened. Besides the terrible human damage done to people in Ukraine and to the territory of Ukraine, including its infrastructure, its dams, and so forth, that invasion has pushed up grain prices. Now, Russia firing missiles to try and wreck the ports of Ukraine to push up grain prices even further has an impact directly onto inflation in the Punjab. So this is a global issue. And I agree with what the Indian government said at the start, where you've got to respect territorial integrity, the rule of law, and the UN Charter. Now, the doing of that is tough. But I think that India will remain an extremely central country for the world. And we have to come together to find a way of dealing with what Russia has done in Ukraine.
Okay, taking that question one step further, one of the concerns has been that when you see foreign policy purely from a particular prism, are we then recognizing the predicament, if I can call it that, for a country like India in a situation of this nature, and how will this possibly be a barrier or a hurdle as you move forward?
So I think a lot of countries have been thrust into very difficult situations because of Mr. Putin's misadventure in Ukraine. If you look at the fuel prices and the food prices that the High Commissioner mentioned, it is having an extremely deleterious effect in countries in South Asia, in Africa, all around the world. And these are countries that don't have India's strength, they don't have India's prosperity. And so I think the collective, the world collective, has been trying to address these very dire implications, these global implications of the war. That said, we all, I think, agree that the war must end. It's unacceptable. There's a lot of human suffering. And that's where we have to focus on mitigating that human suffering. And that includes coherent economic policies that boost economic growth so that countries can get over, in many cases, foreign exchange crises that have happened. India, of course, has over $600 billion in foreign currency reserves. It doesn't face that crisis, but many of its neighbors do. And India has been exceptionally generous toward its neighbors. And the United States and Great Britain and others have worked very hard to try to mitigate that human impact. Also, I think there's a realization that countries have to develop closer relations. So, for instance, this year in my country, we had the great honor of welcoming the Prime Minister of India for only the 3rd official state visit by a leader from India in the entire history of our relationship. It was, I would say, a sixer. You guys knocked the ball out of the park, out of the stadium, and had a magnificent visit that resonated so well with the American people and focused our future effort on the things that reflect our shared values, our shared work program, and bring us even closer together. So when these problems happen in world affairs, The challenge is how to react to them. And I think the US and India are reacting in a very constructive and positive way, looking at a very future-focused frame about the happiness of our countries, our citizens, and frankly, all of humanity.
Would you see that as a fundamental change in the Indo-US relations, post this visit? The fact that, okay, we have our sticking points, let's keep that aside, but we can't allow that to have an impact on the other aspects of our relationship, which has become essential for both sides.
So the wave chop in international relations is only getting higher. And there's a lot of uncertainty, geostrategic uncertainty. This is the worst war in Europe since World War II. And it has not been a short war. It is indeed lingering in ways that make life very tough for Ukrainian people and many others besides. But there's also geostrategic uncertainty in the Indo-Pacific region. And so I think that pragmatic, forward-leaning countries that are democracies like the United States and India find that they have even greater relevance for each other, including in things like the Quad with other democracies. This is the sort of collaboration that I think is going to be the focus of the United States and other countries going forward, is who are our friends, with whom do we have shared values, and what can we do together to ensure the future happiness of humanity and human freedom. Again, I'm a retired diplomat, but these are my observations based on what I see as a very collaborative framework between Delhi and Washington over the past year.
Retired diplomats have the liberty of being a little more honest and open than a serving one. But, just putting this across, Amitabh Kant, and taking off from the point that you made, India Sherpa Amitabh Kant said the G20 under India's leadership is more powerful than the UN Security Council. How would you respond to that?
I'd like to point out that serving diplomats can also be honest as well. It's not part of the job description. So they do different things. What the G20 brings is the kind of mass of roughly 80% of the world's GDP, I would think. And that includes, and it's a body which can actually reflect the shift in growth over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, the sort of G7/EU GDP was about, I can't remember how much it was in the world, but it's roughly, it's dropped quite a lot. And, the new countries have grown a great deal. So it reflects that. It was actually revived by, dare I say, the United States and the United Kingdom in 2008 when we had the global financial crisis. If you remember then, there was a huge international effort led by the United States and the UK to try and address that problem. So it serves its purpose well. What I really like about the Indian presidency is kind of injected some new life into it and has that ambition about the big global problems we need to face. The UN Security Council and the UN system as a whole, well, it's the system we've got. It's the United Nations, and we've got to make it work. There is no choice in that from my point of view. It needs reform. The Security Council definitely needs reform, including India coming onto the Security Council. But you have to make work what you have, because at the same time as the world's probably more divided than when I've been kind of working professionally. I joined the Foreign Service in 1990. The big global problems have got bigger. And so you have that tension between both the dysfunctional parts of the international system, but the need for it to address the really big things, health security, climate security, a whole host of other stuff.
So given that point that you make, saying that the world is more divided, would something like a G20, and I'm just trying to understand the import of that statement, would G20 become then a possible additional platform where you could have conversations even between these two sides, which are very difficult? Countries like India could potentially be the ones which can facilitate the conversations in a divided world.
I mean, to be honest, there is Russia invading Ukraine, and then there's most of the rest of the world. So in that sense, most of the rest of the world would say, we really want to get on, as India does.
And China as well on another side.
I mean, China has a particular position as well, and that's been tough work. I must say, can I just pay respect to the G20 presidency for trying to persevere with getting agreed texts and stuff like that. This is really important stuff. Digital public infrastructure, deforestation, we have been backing the Indian presidency all the way. So actually, I think the vast majority want to get on with dealing with those issues. The trouble is, one of the members of the G20 invading a democracy to kind of injects something very poisonous into that international system, and that's what we're trying to deal with.
You would like to add on to that?
I think the UN Security Council would greatly benefit from having India on board.
That's an interesting one. You know, in terms of your quintessential moment of India's G20 presidency, if you were to take one defining moment in this whole thing, what would that be? I mean, is there something, or would you like to wait for the leaders meet before you choose the moment that you want?
So for me, whenever I come to India, I feel like my dreams as a little boy have come true. Because I've been coming to India since I was a baby. My parents came here every year for the first 15 years of my life. And we would go to Panipat and sit in my grandmother's house with no electricity. There was certainly no internet back then. There wasn't even TV. I remember when the flush toilets were put in. So I'm revealing my age a little bit. But when you look at the India of today, and I've been very privileged and fortunate to go all around this country in the recent past, it is amazing the pace of revolutionary change in the lives of Indian people. If you look at telephony, I remember when it took almost an act of Congress to make a telephone call between Panipat and Delhi. You know, you had to book the call, then go home, then wait for the kid to come and say, no, now the call has come. Then you scream down the phone line. You know, with a little bit of age, you gain perspective. And I feel like that India of my dreams has already been achieved. What is critical now is to see in this G20 year the realization of the dreams of the Indians of today. And I think India is going to achieve those dreams. It is truly going to shine on the global stage over the next 30, 40, 50 years. And it's frankly going to make the world better. So I'm very positive and optimistic. I've seen this country come so far. I see Indians living happier lives. And I pray that that continues for a very long time to come.
Well, that's reflective of the people-to-people contact we've had over decades between both the countries. And when you speak about that, as far as the UK is concerned, one of the sticking points, one of the issues that's in conversation at the moment is the free trade agreement. Is there a deadline for it? Is there something you can, in your honest self as a diplomat, serving diplomat, give us a little bit of a insight into what's happening?
I've just come out of the meeting between our two trade ministers, Piyush Goyal and Kemi Badenoch. That was a very good meeting. Our minister would always say text before time, that you have to get the text right rather than setting artificial deadlines. I think, firstly, we have come a long way. We actually closed the majority of the chapters of the FTA. Secondly, we're now discussing today some of the tough stuff which we need to deal with to get this deal right. It has to be a deal which works for both sides. But I think, thirdly, I saw kind of determination and ambition on both sides to get this done. It's a huge opportunity for both sides. It provides a lot of economic benefit. It'll increase trade and investment, and that's got to be good for both of our countries. I think it has a strategic benefit as well. Going back to what Atul was saying earlier about the kind of world we're in, that between two democracies, which are the fifth and sixth biggest economies in the world, you can create a trade deal. I think that sends a pretty powerful signal to the rest of the world about what can be done.
Okay. And in terms of increasing free movement between the two countries, it's again, it looks very differently when you look at it from an India point of view. It looks very differently when you see it from a Washington or a London. What steps do you think are being taken, or the concrete roadmap for that?
So I think it's critical that we facilitate the free movement of free people in order to ensure the strongest possible growth of the US-India relationship. Wait times have to be addressed, and they are being urgently addressed by my former colleagues, and I applaud them, and I hope they succeed famously. One of the most important elements of this is the announcement in the joint statement of the President and the Prime Minister to announce 2 new consulates of the United States in India, in Bangalore and in Ahmedabad, and increasing Indian consulates in the United States. This is very, very important. However, we still have to speed it up so that people don't have to wait so long. This is, in a way, although it's no consolation, a very good problem to have, because what it reflects is the sheer demand for travel between the United States and India. And you see all of the proliferation of nonstop flights between our two countries, something unimaginable when I was a kid. You had to transfer Frankfurt at 2 o'clock in the morning. And so we've come a long way, but we urgently need to fix the problem. And I'm very happy in my conversations with my colleagues, former colleagues at the US government, that they understand the problem, they're working very hard on it, and they're putting real money and resources into trying to address it.
In the case of the UK, India, it tops all three of our main visa categories: students, visits, and skilled workers. A third of all visas in those three categories go to Indian nationals. India's overtaken China as the #1 supplier of international students to the UK. I'm delighted to say, sorry Atul, that our waiting times are excellent. Turning around our visit visas in 13 days within the 15-day working day standard. So there's a huge flow. Now that's an old flow as well, and you can see that by the inhabitants of number 10 Downing Street. I mean, did you ever imagine that you would see the person who lives in number 10 Downing Street on India's National Day, the 15th of August, in one of the greatest and oldest universities of the world, saying Jai Shri Ram? Yeah? I think Lord Curzon would have... as I said, Lord Curzon would have choked on his kedgeree if he'd ever heard that. So it tells you something about the change in the UK and the benefit which having that flow of people between India and the UK brings. We do have one problem, and the problem is I want more British people to come here. I think that not enough people in the UK know the reality of India today and India tomorrow. And to go back to the question you asked earlier, which I took a really good response to, if I have one thing which defines me that India's G20 presidency, is that when a British minister comes here, when a British official comes in, they come all over the country, what they see is tomorrow's world.
Interesting. That's a real deep insight into what you see. As we build on this going forward, what do you think are the critical challenges ahead? Because much of this is still work in progress. And what do you think are 3 or 4 things that India as a country needs to be extremely cautious about? And also, from a global point of view, that people are looking very closely at as indicators for the road ahead.
I'll talk about the UK and India together, but also the world more generally. The promotion of freedom and opportunity around the world is going to be one of the biggest challenges and the most important things, because you want to give the next generation those opportunities. So we have to do that together. One of the things you learn from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that every country needs friends. Ukraine is much smaller than Russia, but it has friends, and it sees the opportunity. It's brought the country together, and I think we have to learn from that to develop that opportunity. Number one. Secondly, we have to do this sustainably. What India does internally in terms of the building of the cities of the future, the infrastructure of the future, is going to determine to an extent what happens to our climate. Now, it's tough on India. India didn't produce these emissions historically. My country did, the United States did. But we have to work together to find the solutions of the future, and that is very much a joint effort. The third one I'd pick out is health and health security. The best thing the UK and India have done together in a very long time is the Covishield vaccine. Started in a great university in the UK, developed by a British firm, but then India's vast scale and capacity to produce a vaccine, which is a complex thing to produce, and put it into over 1 billion people, including in the neighbours. I completely agree about the generosity of that. That is something you do together. And those 3 things seem to be worthwhile tasks for the next 20 years.
Hi, Commissioner. May I steal your phraseology from your previous question? It was so superb about how when you come to India, you get that sense in the G20 year of the vision of the future. I love it. So hopefully I'll avoid paying royalties on it, but I'm going to steal it and use it a lot. If I may, I'll confine my response to the business and economic environment. I think this is, in fact, emphatically India's golden moment. The whole world is realizing the stability and the opportunity and the reliability and the positivity of India. And so my respectful appeal would be, and I hear this from the members of my trade council, is that in this golden moment, India can do a lot to appeal to the psychology of capital. Investment in will create jobs, it'll create prosperity, it'll result in exports, it'll create a boost in GDP. Frankly, seeing India be a $5, $10, $20 trillion economy is good for the United States, it's good for the entire world, and we want to see it happen. So in this regard, my mantras, or shlokas as it will, are ease of doing business, level playing field, and regulatory and policy predictability. If these things happen, I think you will see the world of global business beat a path to your door and help accelerate the process of India's rise to becoming potentially the largest economy on earth.
As you make that point, quick last few questions. Do you believe domestic political developments in the US perhaps would have an impact? Is there a growing, one gets all kinds of news from the US. So would you believe that those would have an impact in the long term? How is that being seen across the board?
Well, you know, you could have a closed system where you hide all of your flaws and problems, where you don't have a robust internal debate, your people can't speak freely, and someone tells them what to do. I personally don't think that's a good way, a good governance model for humanity. We are free, and we should remain free. So in the United States, and I speak as a private citizen, the disclaimer I'll keep issuing, we do our business in public, in the harsh light of the TV glare light, of the lights. And that's kind of healthy, right? Ours is a robust, messy democracy. Every one of our citizens proudly expresses their opinions, and it's cathartic. I would argue that coming out of the pandemic, free societies like India, the United States, the United Kingdom have powered through the pandemic and have come out of it much better off. We've had a brutal time, we've lost millions of citizens, and yet our democracies essentially reinforce the robust nature of our societies. There are many other models that are far more brittle, that have a lot more risk. And so our democracy is 240 years old, it is robust, it has been through some really tough times, and I think it will continue to power through because we do it in a very cathartic kind of manner as free people do.
We're not yet trumped as yet. So, you know, you've had a great time in India. You've enjoyed the food, you've had the music. Is there one above all that you find the most attractive aspect, the aspect that you enjoyed the most?
I love the food. I was having a dal bati last week in Jodhpur with some churma afterwards, absolutely fantastic. Rasgulla in Casey Das in Kolkata, I remember that, it's fantastic.
And you're
Don't
still
all
here
the
to have this
Bengalis out there.
conversation.
Just thought I better get that in there. I had my head taken off by a lal mas in Jaisalmer, which took me to the extremes of everything. It was an amazing dish. Great fish curry in Goa as well. Actually, I love the food. I'm a cricket nut, so I love all that. And as you know, I love the music too. And
Is there a song that you'd like to sing for us?
you have a wonderful national anthem.
I'm from South India.
We have a great national anthem as well. But I was thinking, what is the song? What is the song which we should be singing together in the future? Which you know, and I thought, you know, Ye dosti hum nahi chhodenge, todenge dam agar मैं तेरे बारात के साथ ना छोड़ेंगे.
Wow, wow, wow. That's fascinating. Do you want to have a go?
I am going to defer and submit and bow down to the High Commissioner of the United Kingdom. He did a great job. But what I will say is that India delights me every day in so many different ways. The food, obviously, the fact that there's been so much development in the course of my lifetime. And India touches the heart in unexpected ways all the time. I have a daughter who was born here in India, and so India remains immensely precious to me. My wife and I spent some of our most wonderful years in the Foreign Service here in India, and so that feeling of the heart always abides. And I wish India the greatest of success and happiness.
Well, I think the most beautiful aspect of the song that you sang is that I'm from South India and it's still iconic for me, Amitabh Bachchan and Dharmendra on a bullet singing this song. So that's possibly the story of India. Ye dosti hum nahi chodenge. So that's you know, fascinating for the two of you to have shared your thoughts. If there is any question from the audience, don't ask them to sing another song. Anything else is okay. Please, sir.
Otherwise, it's just going to continue. So can you both of you, can you throw some light on that?
Sir, could you repeat your question? Because we have a television audience watching this as well. And
shall I answer the question by repeating the question? The question was about how do you end the war in Ukraine, given the situation on the ground, sir, if I understand, General. And, well, there's a simple answer, which is Russia goes back to its own territory, and Ukraine is allowed to live in its own territory. And I think anyone in this room is going to be sensitive to autocracies deciding arbitrarily to invade democracies. What you have to have is to look at across the whole thing, and actually Zelensky's produced a peace plan, others have as well. But you have to, if you concede the principle that an autocracy can occupy a democracy's land and stay there, then that is a very concerning principle for the world as a whole. In the end, it will require international support. That's why I think India was right to reference the UN Charter in its first statement it made about it. We are going to have to find a way to deal with this, but it is tough.
On that note, I think we'll have to end this conversation for the next session. I'm sorry, we don't have time for any further questions. Thank you, too, for that fascinating conversation, and thank you, High Commissioner, for that.
What's the word?
for the song. Fascinating. Thanks. Lovely. Show stealer, yes. Thank you, too, for joining us this time.
Once again, welcome back to this grand finale on the G20 Conclave right here on Ndtv. आज दिन भर हमने तमाम लोगों की बातें सुनी और मकसद ये बातें सुनने का सिर्फ एक था, ये जानने के लिए कि ये जो G20 समिट होगी भारत में, उसके पीछे का उद्देश्य क्या है, जो बातें हो रही हैं वो क्या हासिल करेंगी। अंत में बात है पावर की, और पावर सत्ता हथियाने वाली पावर नहीं, पावर मतलब बिजली, ऊर्जा। So we are happy to have with us on stage Minister of Power and Minister of New and Renewable Energy, Mr. R.K. Singh. Thank you very much for joining us, sir.
It's a real pleasure.
मेरा सबसे पहला सवाल ये है, और मैं शुरू ही इससे करना चाहता हूँ। G20 को लेकर के हमने देखा है कि it is a matter of great pride for India to host the G20. तमाम जगह इसके हमने पोस्टर देखे हैं, घर घर तक ये बात चली गई है कि G20 की समिट भारत में हो रही है. It's a matter of great pride for everyone, for the fact that we are playing host to so many countries. But sir, एक आम आदमी के लिए जो ये पोस्टर देख रहा है, जो ये सारी चीज़ें देख रहा है, इतना बड़ा समिट हो रही है, इस समिट के अंत में जब बड़े बड़े लोग चले जाएंगे, इस समिट से उसके लिए संदेश क्या होगा?
G20 समिट में जैसे कि अन्य मल्टीलैटरल फोरम में होता है, कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑफ पार्टीज इत्यादि में होता है, या G7 में होता है, वो देश और दुनिया के भविष्य की एक ट्रेजेक्टरी क्या हो, भविष्य के लिए रास्ता क्या हो, इस पर बातचीत होती है कि व्हाट शुड बी द पाथ विच द डिफरेंट कंट्रीज द वर्ल्ड शुड टेक looking at the challenges before it, and that determines actually, that impacts everyday lives. जैसे कि मैं अपने क्षेत्र को ले लूँ, ऊर्जा को, बिजली को, ऊर्जा को, तो ऊर्जा किस प्रकार का हो, यह हर एक आदमी को इम्पैक्ट करता है. It impacts every person, because everybody uses energy. Everybody uses energy. Whether that energy comes from fossil fuels or non-fossil fuels is a question which has an impact on what your cost of electricity will be. That is a question on what it is going to have an impact on the availability of energy. So that is how vital these discussions are, either here or in the Conference of Parties under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we discuss and debate the future of the world, what the world needs to do in the circumstances which are prevailing. Now, the circumstances which are prevailing are, number one, that climate is under, you have climate change. The environment is in peril. This is something which is accepted all over the world. Now, there are very few naysayers who say that global warming is a myth. There used to be a time when you had people saying that, people in high positions saying that global warming is a myth, no more. And the world feels that, you have to have an energy transition in order to meet that, in order to stop or delay global warming, or stop it. And that impacts everybody. वो सबको प्रभावित करता है कि हम किस तरह से एनर्जी बनाते हैं. अब जैसे मैं बता दूं, अगर आज आप कहेंगे कि फॉसिल फ्यूल बिल्कुल रुक जाए, तो 24 घंटे बिजली मिलने में कठिनाई होगी. इसलिए कि रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी दिन में है, जबकि सूरज है. When the sun shines, you can make solar. When the wind blows, and the sun shines only during the day, it doesn't shine at night. And when the wind does not blow, you don't have energy. So you need storage. Now, storage is expensive. And the world has not addressed it. The developed world. I have a grouse with the developed world for that. They've been talking about how important it is to stop global warming and how important climate change is, but they did nothing about it. So storage is absolutely essential if you want round-the-clock renewable energy. And today the price of storage is, I had a bid of 1,000 megawatt hours. It was one of the largest bids in the world. And the price came to 10 rupees per kilowatt hour. Whereas my renewable energy cost is 2 rupees 60 paise per kilowatt hour. So you get 1 unit of energy for 2 rupees 60 paise. To store it for 1 hour, you need to pay 10 rupees. So the total cost comes to 12 rupees 60 paise. Now, that's not viable. So you have to add volumes for storage. Now, we are doing that. But if the developed world had started doing this when they had started talking about the climate, then today we would not have had such a situation. So actually, whatever we discuss has implications for the common man. It has implications for the rate of growth of the country. Because you can't have growth without energy. There won't be any industry without energy. Your ventilators, your lifts, nothing will run without electricity. And therefore, energy security is the most important thing. Now, I'll tell you one thing, that what we have done is that we have emerged as a country whose rate of transition is one of the fastest in the world. Our rate of renewable energy capacity addition is the fastest in the world, not one of, but is the fastest in the world. We have achieved our NDCs 9 years in advance. And all this while making sure that electricity is available for our growth. And and that growth is actually substantial. You have our country growing at 7.2%. My power demand grew at 6.7%. The difference between the growth between 2021 and 21-22 was 6.7%. And the growth between 21-22, in demand, I'm saying, the growth between from 21-22 to 22-23 was 6.3%. In 23-24, in the first quarter, the growth was 7.8%. In July, the growth was 9.7%. In August, the growth has been 21% in demand terms and 16.7% in energy terms. And that in a huge country whose total demand, the peak demand is 234,000 megawatts. You have to add, I think, most of the countries of Europe to come to that. But we are meeting it. That peak demand of 234,000 megawatts, the shortage was only 236 megawatts out of 234,000 megawatts. So that's what we've done. We've grown. We made sure that our electricity supply is as required for our growth, and it will continue to be so because we are adding capacity, huge capacities. And we have at the same time emerged as the only country whose energy transition actions are commensurate with a sub-2-degree rise in global temperature. So as I was telling my friend here, I told my friend two things when I landed. So I am wearing a dress which I should have been wearing. But that was, that apart. So I told him this, that when I first joined in 2017, it's almost 6 years now, then, my interlocutors from the Western countries used to come and talk to me about how necessary it is to transition, things like that, and how India should be doing more. Now, no more. It just took me 2 years. And after that, now nobody sort of talks to me about that. They are mostly on the defensive because I tell them that, look, I've done this. What have you done? So we are in a different place.
I think that's, let's pick up from the point where you have left. Do you feel that it is slightly rich on the part of the developed world to expect a lot from leaders and countries in the global south to do more to address the issue of climate change, whereas even now as we speak, they are polluting more.
Absolutely, I'll tell you what. You see, just look at the figures. And that's why, now people from the developed world become defensive when I start, when they come and meet me. Our per capita emissions are 2.19 tons per year. The world per capita emissions are 6.4 tons per year. That's per capita. So our per capita emissions are 1/3 of the global average. The per capita emissions of the developed world are 3 times to 4 times the global average. Now, what needs to be done? I mean, if you want to actually reduce, actually limit the global rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees or less, then the per capita consumption has to come down to 2.4 tons. We are very close to that. And the developed world has to reduce its per capita consumptions from, let's say, 18 tons or 20 tons down to 2.4. Now, that's what they have to do. But despite the fact that we are one of the lowest emitters in the world, as I said, we had pledged, what we pledged in COP21 in Paris, that by 2030 we'll have 40% of our capacity coming from non-fossil fuel sources. We achieved that in 2021, 9 years before the due date. Today, my capacity, non-fossil fuel capacity, is 43% in capacity terms, 43%. And that's why in Glasgow we upped our ambition and said that by 2030, we will have 50% of our capacity coming from non-fossil fuel sources. And believe you me, I mean, I'm very close, I'll be very close to achieving that, give a year or so. And by 2030, I will have 65% of my capacity coming from non-fossil fuel sources, because I already have about 187,000 megawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity. I have about 88,000 megawatts under construction of renewable, non-fossil, 88,000 megawatts. That's, already 276,000 megawatts, 276 gigawatts. And I have about 50 gigawatts under various, the bids, etc. So I'll cross that target. 50%, I'll reach 65. Instead of 50%, I'll reach 65%. Emissions intensity we have reduced. We had pledged that by 2030, we'll reduce our emissions intensity by 33%, despite the fact that our emissions intensity, as I said, per capita emissions are one of the lowest in the world. And we achieved that in 2022, because we have some programs which the industry will tell you are the best in the world. Many countries came and copied our program, the program for industry, perform, achieve, trade, where we, lay down specific energy consumption reduction targets. And if you meet that, fine. If you don't meet that, you pay a penalty or you buy energy saving certificates. If you, overachieve, you get energy saving certificates. So that has resulted in a reduction of CO2 emissions by 105 million tons per annum. 105 million tons of CO2 reduction per annum. That's one program. The LED program has resulted in emissions reduction for almost about 103 million tons per annum. Our star rating program, 5-star, air conditioners, 5-star fridges, etc. Now that has resulted in emission reductions of almost 53 million tons per annum. So we have a program for construction, the commercial buildings, the Energy Conservation Building Code, which sets energy consumption standards for commercial buildings, large commercial buildings. And that is mandatory. We have a non-obligatory Eco-Niwas Samhita for residential buildings. We are going to make it mandatory. We are a world leader in energy transition, in climate action. We are a world leader. And at the same time, we are growing. Now, one more thing you must understand, and this is something which I tell the audience everywhere, because unless we know what we have done and what we are doing, we'll not know what the discourse is about, what the narrative is about. And believe you me, that the narrative being spread out by some NGOs in the developed world are totally misleading. And they don't tell you, talk about these figures. They'll, for example, tell you that, look, India is a huge country, therefore its total emissions are high, high. But that's besides the point. I mean, that is ridiculous. You don't decide about the emissions depending on the size of the country. A small island will be consuming huge quantities of energy per capita, yet its overall emissions will be less. You have to talk about it in per capita terms, like you talk about GDP. So the narrative, has to change, and unless until we know the facts, that narrative won't change. So that's why I say this, that we are in a good pace as far as energy transition and climate action is concerned. And that was one of the vital points for discussion in G20. And it will remain a vital point for discussion in all multilateral fora, because climate change is a challenge,
Yes.
Which is looming. It's there, it's right in front of you. So it will be a vital point.
Yeah, Mr. Singh, these figures that you have presented are impressive, no doubt. The fact that we are 9 years ahead of our own target and our own schedule that we promised to the world.
We promised, NDC, not our own. It's an
Yes,
NDC. Yeah.
the promised,
Yeah.
yes. I'm just quoting a report in the Reuters from the 6th of April 2023, not doubting these numbers that you have presented, because you're the master of what you're learning. But according to this report, fossil fuel power output rose fastest in 3 decades. Emissions from power generation rose to 1.15 billion tons. Coal-fired power output was up 12.4%, gas-fired output down 29%. Share of coal in overall power output was up to 73.1%. You can challenge these figures. I will take no blame for this because it's not my report. This is the Reuters.
You see,
And it also says, if you allow me, that renewables output also rose by 21.7%, the share up to 11.8%. Do you feel that while you present impressive numbers, 73.1% coming from coal?
Now, let me tell you this. You see, this just shows the narrative which is being spread around. Now, if you have an economy which is growing at 7%, the electricity has to grow at 9%, 10%. I just gave you the growth figures. Now, if that grows at 9%, 10%, then the coal and the electricity from coal will also grow. My PLF has gone up to 70%. It used to be around 50%. It has to grow if I have to meet that demand. Of course, it will grow. But the point is that our renewable energy capacity is growing faster. As I said, today we have almost 177,000 megawatts which are pure renewable, solar, wind, hydro, biomass, etc. So that will grow, but the wind will, but the thermal will also grow. Now the thermal will grow because, as I said, the sun does not shine at night. The wind does not blow at times. So you have to rely on thermal unless the battery becomes cheaper. And we are talking about a country which is going to grow, keep growing, and it needs energy. And they are talking about countries which have reached, almost the pinnacle of their growth. They are developed countries. So that the paradigm has to shift. That narrative has to change. You must realize one thing. Some figures are wrong. For example, today. And his figures also don't add up, let me tell you. You have 73% coming from fossil, not coal.
Okay.
So the the correspondent who wrote that, he didn't know.
Which is why I said,
he didn't know what he was talking about. So
I attributed.
So he didn't know what he was talking about. I mean, the Reuters correspondents can also be ignorant. See, you must get rid of this mentality, that if it is a Western-based source, so it must be sacrosanct.
I will place these figures in doubt.
Listen to me, listen. And that whatever they say is sacrosanct. Forget it. That's not so. For example, I'll tell you. Actually, let me first answer this. So my total fossil fuel energy is 73%. But that is not only coal. That also includes gas. I have about 24,000 megawatts of gas-based capacity. And my non-fossil fuel energy is in the region, varies day to day depending on the wind, etc., or the sun, about 24%. So the electricity which you see, 24% of that is already renewable. Now tell me what? And 43% of my capacity, 43.5% of my capacity is already non-fossil. Now tell me what? I have increased my renewable energy capacity by 2.5 times in 9 years. Now tell me any country which has done that. And all these figures are there. So tell your Reuters chap to remove his dark box and look at the figures. And one more thing I'll tell you. I will meet the requirement of energy for my growth. Why? I have a right to grow. And till so long as battery storage is not viable, and it is not. As I said, I had one of the largest bids in the world, and tell me which other country has that 1,000 megawatt hours, and another bid of 3,000 megawatt hours of pumped storage, which came to, and the lithium ion bid came to 10 rupees per kilowatt hour. The pumped storage came to about 5 rupees per kilowatt hour. Unless and until that goes down, I will have to rely on fossil fuels. And I'm talking about, and stop talking about coal, talk about fossil fuels. You see, that is the grouse I have with these developed countries. I mean, the hypocrisy is amazing. You see, they talk about coal. They don't talk about the fact that, you have gas, which is also fossil, that also gives out carbon dioxide in huge and copious quantities when you burn it.
Right.
They don't talk about shale, which gives out, carbon dioxide in copious quantities when you burn it. And the shale gives out carbon dioxide, which is equivalent to carbon, to coal. But they don't talk about that. So somehow or the other, they smuggled in a line in COP26 in Glasgow about, the phasing down coal. Thereafter, I was not there, whichever meeting I attended, I said, don't talk about coal, talk about all fossil fuels. You phase down, I have coal, I burn coal. You have gas, you burn gas. You phase down fossil fuels, I agree to phase down fossil fuels. And right now, as I said, I have about 73%, 43% is from non-fossil, so I have about 57% capacity-wise coming from coal and gas. That will come down to 33% by 35% by 2030. So that's fast enough.
Let me ask you this question, Mr. Singh. You see, according to this PIB article on the 3rd of August 2022, it talks about the Panchamrit of India's climate action, right? This includes net zero by 2070, cumulative electric power capacity from non-fossil fuel sources, 40%. You have addressed some of these things. 50%, yes. Reduce emissions intensity of GDP by 33 to 35%. This was updated later. I'm just talking about that Panchamrit, the commitment, and then how we renewed it, which is also, I would say, a great example to set that you are not only meeting your targets, but setting yourself revised targets. Where do you find India on this Panchamrit that we had promised?
I told you. Number one, we are the only country which has met our NDCs way in advance. The NDCs you read out were actually what we pledged in COP21 in Paris. Now that we have already achieved. We had pledged that by 40%, we'll have 40% of our capacity coming from non-fossils by 2030. We achieved that in 2021. Today I have 43.5% coming from non-fossils. Tell me any other country which has achieved its NDC so far in advance. Tell me any other country which has achieved all its NDCs. We had pledged that by 2030 we'll reduce our emissions intensity by 33%, despite having the lowest per capita emissions. Now Reuters doesn't talk about the per capita emissions, does it? It doesn't talk about the 5 SUVs in every home. It doesn't talk about it. So that's the hypocrisy. So this is the NDC which we already achieved well in advance. That's why we increased our ambition. We increased our targets by ourselves in Glasgow, in COP26. And so now 40% becomes 50% by 2030. And in fact, I'll get it well before that. Because as I said, I have 188 gigawatts installed, 88 gigawatts under installation, 276 gigawatts, 50 odd gigawatts under bid, etc., in different phases. That's 320 odd already. My total capacity in 2030 will be about 770 gigawatts. 50% of that is 350 gigawatts.
Mr. Singh,
So as I said, I will not only achieve that before time, I'll go beyond it.
Which is why I'm very curious to ask you this question. The nationally determined
contribution. And tell me
contribution.
which developed country has done this. Name one. And name one developed country which has reduced its per capita emissions. Name one. There you are.
Which is why I want to ask you this question. The nationally determined contribution which we have revised ourselves, setting ourselves extremely ambitious targets and achieving them and revising them also, do you feel that there is a very strong chance that we will achieve our net zero emission ahead of 2070?
Absolutely. I have no doubt about that. But there are two things which you must know and understand. You see, as I said in the beginning, every developing country, and I'm talking about the global south, has a right to grow, right? The developed countries have reached a certain level of per capita incomes. We have a right to grow to that. Now, growth entails consumption and emissions. Now, I'll need to add millions of square feet, trillions of square feet of real estate. My housing will grow, my buildings will grow. That needs cement. That needs steel. Now, if I make steel, you have emissions. If I make cement, you have emissions. And therefore, unless and until CCUS, carbon capture and sequestration, becomes viable, that carbon dioxide will be there, and that's one of the wages of growth. You must know one more thing, that our population is about 17% of the world population. Our contribution to the legacy carbon dioxide load, which has caused this rise in temperature 0.89 degrees, is just 4%. That's where we are at. I mean, you won't have Reuters talking about this. You won't have that. And despite all this, as I said, we have emerged as a leader in energy transition. Despite the fact that our contribution to the legacy carbon dioxide load is, 1/4 of what our population is, less than 1/4 of what our population is. So we'll grow. We'll need more cement. We'll need more steel. We'll need more aluminum. Now, CCUS, and I've been asking questions to all my interlocutors who come from abroad that, okay, you're talking about net zero by 2045, 2050, one or two countries 2045, some countries 2050. How will you do it? I mean, unless you have storage, which is viable, which is affordable, you don't have round-the-clock renewable energy. If you don't have round-the-clock renewable energy, then you can't sort of phase out fossil fuels because you need electricity at night, even for heating, lighting, whatsoever. So it's one of my interlocutors, minister, in a large developed country, he said that, no, we'll go nuclear. That country has about 40% of its capacity coming from nuclear. I said, how much nuclear capacity will you add? Where will you store the waste? There's a question mark. There's a question mark. He talked about small modular reactors. Now, small modular reactors are only still under development, and still under research. So what's your path to net zero? CCUS, you don't have any commercial scale CCUS, even in your country, which is developed, which is a huge country. You just have pilot scale. I also have pilot scale CCUS. And even if you have CCUS, where do you sequester it? CCUS means carbon capture and sequestration. Where do you sequester it? So the answer was that we'll sequester it in the voids left by pumping out oil. So I said, what's the guarantee it won't leak back up? So these questions are there. So net zero has questions. Storage. Unless and until you have storage, you don't have round-the-clock renewable energy. If you don't have round-the-clock renewable energy, you don't have, you can't get to net zero. And storage is expensive. The lithium ion, the total capacity around the world would not exceed, I think, about 20 gigawatts or something like that. We are setting up, we had a PLI for battery storage. We are coming out with another PLI for battery storage. We are building capacities. The developed world did not do that. The 88%, 90% of the lithium processing is in one country, in China. The developed world talked about climate, but they did not add capacity. That's why we are where we are today. That's why the storage is not cheap. So these questions, they don't answer. They don't have answers for that. We are adding capacities. We'll continue adding capacities.
Would you want to raise these at the forum?
I do that. I do that. That's
all
the
time.
I do it all the time. So that's why they become very defensive when they come in front of.
Do they still like you? For being so straight.
My constituents like me. I won elections twice.
Good. That's good.
That's
I
good
think
enough
that's
for
good.
me.
That's all that matters.
The people who need to vote for me, they vote for me. So fine. Yeah.
It's interesting. You mentioned a word called nuclear. Now, I just thought in 2000, that in the erstwhile UPA government, that government went big on betting on nuclear energy as perhaps the way to meet India's energy requirement. Where are we vis-a-vis, attaining these goals and using nuclear?
Yes. We want to expand nuclear, no doubt about that. My current nuclear capacity is about 4,700 odd megawatts.
You think it should increase?
Huh?
You think it should increase?
Absolutely, absolutely. We want, we have nuclear capacities under planning stage and construction state of about 15 gigawatts, 15,000 megawatts. We want to do more on this. But we have to keep that in mind, the safety aspects. So that is something. But we are nowhere near where the developed countries are. I mean, you have France, which has almost 55% of its capacity of its energy coming from nuclear. As you have another large country in the United States, I think almost 40% of its capacity is coming from nuclear. So our nuclear is minuscule, and the rate of growth of capacity is also slow for many reasons. One, of course, was you have the NGOs kicking up a row as soon as you start constructing nuclear power plants. You had Conclave, etc. That huge row. I was Home Secretary then, so that huge row broke out. And I was curious to find out, who was financing this. Once I started investigations, the row died out. And you have the plant there. Similarly, you look at the developed world, they have exploited 89% of their hydro capacity. When we started adding to our hydro capacity, you had NGOs sort of demonstrating. And, we went before I carried out a survey. Not carried out a survey. I actually engaged an IIT to carry out a survey, independently, of the impact of hydro projects on environment. And the results, are totally different from what has been portrayed. That survey report I have released. In fact, I'll send that to you. The survey found that wherever hydro projects have been constructed, the incidence of landslides has decreased. It's not increased, it has decreased.
Now that's
news,
yes, Mr. Singh.
It found that the environment around that project improved. The water retention capacity, the flora, the fauna has improved.
No, Mr. Singh, many environmentalists will not agree with you. Because many environmentalists
it's a research. It's not my data. Yeah. And research by an IIT, and the figures are there for everyone to see, and we have released it openly. So let anybody, till now, nobody has come up with figures.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I think this report should be seen, reported on, and perhaps,
Please.
That'll be great.
Yeah.
Now,
I'll send a copy if you want.
Sure.
I mean, my Pawan is here somewhere.
Sure.
So send a copy.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll wait for Pawan ji to send it. In the meanwhile, एक सवाल मैं हिंदी में आपसे इसलिए पूछना चाहता हूँ क्योंकि गुजरात चुनाव के दौरान जब हम वहाँ गए तो वहाँ लोगों के घर में जो हो रहा था वो देख करके बहुत इंटरेस्ट आया और वो इसलिए आया क्योंकि वहाँ पर लोग ये कह रहे थे कि हम बिजली सिर्फ ग्रिड से ले ही नहीं रहे हैं, एक ऐसा सिस्टम है यहाँ पर क्योंकि हमने अपनी एक सोलर पैनल लगाया हुआ है तो हम ग्रिड को कंट्रीब्यूट भी कर रहे हैं और वो प्लस और माइनस हो करके कभी कभार वो कहते हैं हमको पैसा आता है,
एकदम आता है,
पैसा देने बिजली का बिल देने के बजाय हमको बिजली की कंपनी पैसा देती है,
एकदम
सो वी आर कंट्रीब्यूटिंग टू द ग्रिड.
एकदम.
हाउ होपफुल आर यू कि ये मॉडल पूरे देश में लागू हो जाए क्योंकि हम दिन में तो कम से कम बहुत ही धूप रहती है, रोशनी रहती है.
नहीं, देखिए, हम आशाओं में विश्वास नहीं करते, हम तो विश्वास करते हैं करने में. हमने एक नियम बना दिया. नियम है, नियम यह है कि हमने उस नियम का नाम हमने रखा है राइट्स ऑफ प्रोस्यूमर्स. यानी कि कंज्यूमर होता है उपभोक्ता, प्रोस्यूमर होता है जो कि प्रोड्यूस भी करता है, बिजली पैदा भी करता है और कंज्यूम भी करता है, यानी कि अपने रूफ पर सोलर रूफटॉप लगाता है. उसका हमने एक नियम बना दिया है कि कोई भी व्यक्ति कह सकता है कि हमको अपने छत पर सोलर चाहिए और सोलर लगाने का उसको अधिकार है. डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कंपनी, जो वितरण कंपनी है, उसमें आपत्ति नहीं कर सकती है. और आप लगाएं 3 किलोवाट तक, जो भी उसका खर्च आएगा उसका 40% मैं दूंगा, भारत सरकार देगी. हमने पहले तो होता था कि हम राज्यों को कैपेसिटी देते थे और उनको कहते थे कि आप लगवाइए. उसके बाद वो तो हम करते ही हैं. उसके बाद फिर हमने एक पूरा वेबसाइट बना दिया. पूरा आप कहीं भी देश में कहीं भी हो, आप उस वेबसाइट पर जाएं, आप उसमें अपने घर का पता होता है इंडिकेट कर दें उसको और आ जाएगा कि हमको सोलर लगाना है कितना किलोवाट का. इंसिडेंटली मैं बता दूं, 3 किलोवाट तक 40% हम देते हैं सब्सिडी, और 3 किलोवाट से लेकर के 10 किलोवाट तक 20% हम देते हैं. तो उसमें प्रथम 3 किलोवाट के लिए 40% दे देंगे, अब बाकी 7 किलोवाट के लिए हम 20% देंगे, और ये नेट मीटरिंग होगा। नेट मीटरिंग का मतलब है 500 किलोवाट तक। नेट मीटरिंग का मतलब ये है कि अगर आपका कंजम्पशन है सपोज 200 यूनिट है, तो आप 200 यूनिट वाले ब्रैकेट में हैं, और आपके सोलर जो पैनल है उसने प्रोड्यूस किया ये करीब 150 यूनिट प्रोड्यूस किया, तो आपको पेमेंट करना होगा सिर्फ 50 यूनिट के लिए। अब वो 50 यूनिट पेमेंट करना होगा वो लोअर रेट पर, क्योंकि आप उस ब्रैकेट में आ जाएंगे, तो आपको बहुत सारा ये गेन होगा, बेनिफिट होगा। तो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कंपनियां नहीं चाहती थी इसको, इसीलिए हमने नियम बना दिया। ये आपका अधिकार है, वेबसाइट है। एक तो ये स्टेट्स करती हैं, हमने टेंडर करने का स्टेट्स को कर दिया है, अब वो कर भी रही हैं, लेकिन वेबसाइट पर जाएं, अपना इंटीग्रेटर चुनें कि हाँ साहब सो हमको फलाना कंपनी चाहिए इंटीग्रेटर, वो आकर करके सर्वे कर देगा और आपको बता देगा कितना किलोवाट लगेगा, आप ओके कर दीजिए, वो आकर के लगा देगा। और ये अपलोड आप कर दीजिए कि लग गया, तो आपके अकाउंट में पैसा सब्सिडी का पैसा,
मतलब सिंह साहब ये कोई भी कर सकता है,
ये कोई भी कर सकता है। अब कोई बैंक अगर लोन नहीं देती है आपको, तो हमको बताएं, क्योंकि सभी बैंकर्स को बैठा करके हमने उनको तैयार कराया है कि आप फंडिंग करेंगे, फाइनेंसिंग।
I think this is a great
कोई आपत्ति नहीं।
this is a great point on consumer awareness where you can actually not just consume power but be a producer of power also.
और ये हम होर्डिंग अब इंडिया में सब जगह लगाने वाले। वैसे तो सब जगह लगाने के लिए मैंने अपने मंत्रालय को कहा कम से कम 6 महीना पहले, तो अभी तक लग ही रहा है। मैं उसको फिर चेंज कर रहा हूं।
आपने अपने मंत्रालय की क्लास ले ली।
Yeah.
Mr. R.K. Singh, thank you so much for your time.
pleasure.
Thank you.